Chapter 18. She took a taxi from the airport. There was no one at the villa because it had been closed, and Elizabeth had not told anyone she was coming. She let herself in and walked slowly through the large familiar rooms, and it was as if she had never been away. She had not realized how much she had missed the place. It seemed to Elizabeth that the few happy memories of her childhood had been here. It felt strange to be alone in this labyrinth where there had always been half a dozen servants bustling around, cooking, cleaning, polishing. Now there was only herself and the echoes of the past. She left Sam's attache case in the downstairs hallway and carried her suitcase upstairs. With the habit of long years, she started to head for her bedroom in the center of the hallway, then stopped. Her father's room was at the far end. Elizabeth turned and walked toward it. She opened the door slowly, because while her mind understood the reality, some deep atavistic instinct made her half expect to see Sam there, to hear the sound of his voice. The room was empty, of course, and nothing had changed since Elizabeth had last seen it. It contained a large double bed, a beautiful highboy, a dressing table, two comfortable overstuffed chairs, and a couch in front of the fireplace. Elizabeth set down her suitcase and walked over to the window. The iron shutters had been closed against the late September sun, and the draperies were drawn. She opened them wide and let the fresh mountain air flow in, soft and cool with the promise of fall. She would sleep in this room. Elizabeth returned downstairs and went into the library. She sat down in one of the comfortable leather chairs, rubbing her hands along the sides. This was where Reese always sat when he had a conference with her father. She thought about Reese and wished that he were here with her. She remembered the night he had brought her back to school after dinner in Paris, and how she had gone back to her room and had written Mrs. Reese Williams over and over. On an impulse, Elizabeth walked over to the desk, picked up a pen and slowly wrote, Mrs. Reese Williams. She looked at it and smiled. I wonder, she mocked herself aloud, how many other idiots are doing the same thing right now? She turned her thoughts away from Reese, but still he was at the back of her mind, pleasantly comforting. She got up and wandered around the house. She explored the large, old-fashioned kitchen with its wood-burning stove and two ovens. She walked over to the refrigerator and opened it. It was empty. She should have anticipated that, with the house shut down. Because the refrigerator was empty, she became suddenly hungry. She searched the cupboards. There were two small cans of tuna fish, a half-filled jar of Nescafe, and an unopened package of crackers. If she was going to be her for a long weekend, Elizabeth decided, she had better do some planning. Rather than drive into town for every meal, she would shop at one of the little markets in Cala Volpe and stock enough food for several days. A utility jeep was always kept in the carport, and she wondered if it was still there. She went to the back of the kitchen and through the door that led to the carport, and there was the jeep. Elizabeth walked back into the kitchen, where, on a board behind the cupboard, were hooks with labeled keys on them. She found the key to the jeep and returned to the carport. Would there be gasoline in it? She turned the key and pressed the starter. Almost immediately the motor sparked into life. So that problem was eliminated. In the morning she would drive into town and pick up whatever groceries she needed. She went back into the house. As she walked across the tiled floor of the reception hall, she could hear the echo of her footsteps, and it was a hollow, lonely sound. She wished that Alec would call, and even as she was thinking it, the telephone rang, startling her. She walked to it and picked it up. Hello? Elizabeth, it's Alec here. Elizabeth laughed aloud. What is so funny? You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Where are you? Down in Gloucester. And Elizabeth felt a sudden, urgent impulse to see him, to tell him her decision about the company, but not over the telephone. Would you do me a favor, Alec? You know I will. Could you fly down here for the weekend? I'd like to discuss something with you." There was only the slightest hesitation, and then Alex said, "Of course!" Not a word about what engagements he would have to break, how inconvenient it might be. Just, "Of course." That was Alec. Elizabeth forced herself to say, "And bring Vivian." "I'm afraid she won't be able to come. She's, rather involved in London. I can drive tomorrow morning. Will that do?" "Perfect. Let me know what time, and I'll pick you up at the airport." "It will be simpler if I just take a taxi." "All right. Thank you, Alec. Very much." When Elizabeth replaced the receiver, she was feeling infinitely better. She knew she had made the right decision. She was in this position only because Sam had died before he had had the time to name his successor. Elizabeth wondered who the next president of Ruff and Sons would be. The board could decide that for themselves. She thought about it from Sam's point of view, and the name that sprang instantly to mind was Rhys Williams. The others were competent in their own areas, but Rhys was the only one who had a working knowledge of the company's complete global operation. He was brilliant and effective. The problem, of course, was that Rhys was not eligible to be president, because he was not a Ruff, or married to a Ruff. He could not even sit on the board. Elizabeth walked into the hallway and saw her father's attache case. She hesitated. There was hardly any point in her going through it now. She could give it to Alec when he arrived in the morning. Still, if there was something personal in it, she carried it into the library, set it on a desk, untapped the key and opened the little locks on each side. In the center of the case was a large manila envelope. Elizabeth opened it and removed a sheaf of typewritten papers lying loosely in a cardboard cover labeled Mr. Sam Ruff, confidential, no copies. It was obviously a report of some kind, but without anyone's name on it so that Elizabeth could not know who had drawn it. She had started to skim through the report, then slowed down, then stopped. She could not believe what she was reading. She carried the papers over to her armchair, kicked off her shoes, curled her legs underneath her, and turned to page 1 again. This time she read every word, and she was filled with horror. It was an astonishing document, a confidential report of an investigation into a series of events that had occurred over the past year. In Chile, a chemical plant owned by Ruff and Sons had exploded, sending tons of poisonous material spouting over a 10-square-mile area. 12 people had been killed. Hundreds more had been taken to hospitals. All livestock had died. The vegetation was poisoned. The entire region had had to be evacuated. The lawsuits filed against Ruff and Sons had run into hundreds of millions of dollars. But the shocking thing was that the explosion had been deliberate. The report read, "The Chilean government's investigation into the accident was cursory. The official attitude seems to be, the company is rich, the people are poor. Let the company pay." There is no question in the minds of our investigating staff but that it was an act of sabotage by a person or persons unknown using plastic explosives. Because of the antagonistic official attitude here, it will be impossible to prove. Elizabeth remembered the incident only too well. Newspapers and magazines had been full of horror stories complete with photographs of the victims, and the world's press had attacked Ruff and Sons, accusing it of being careless and indifferent to human suffering. It had damaged the image of the company badly. The next section of the report dealt with major research projects that Ruff and Sons scientists had been working on for a number of years. There were 4 projects listed, each of them inestimable potential value. Combined, they had cost more than $50 million to develop. In each case, a rival pharmaceutical firm had applied for a patent to one of the products, just ahead of Ruff and Sons, using the identical formula. The report continued. One isolated incident might have been put down as coincidence. In a field where dozens of companies are working in related areas, It is inevitable that several companies might be working on the same type of product. But 4 such incidents in a period of a few months forced us to the conclusion that someone in the employ of Roth and Sons gave or sold the research material to the competitive firms. Because of the secret nature of the experiments and the fact that they were conducted in widely separated laboratories under conditions of maximum security, our investigation indicates that the person or persons behind this would need to have access to top security clearances. We therefore conclude that whoever is responsible is someone in the highest executive echelon of Roth and Sons. There was more. A large batch of toxic drugs had been mislabeled and shipped. Before they could be recalled, there were several deaths and more bad publicity for the company. No one could learn where the wrong labels had come from. A deadly toxin had disappeared from a heavily guarded laboratory. Within an hour, an unidentified person had leaked the story to the newspapers and started a scare hunt. The afternoon shadows had long since lengthened into evening, and the night air had turned chilly. Elizabeth remained totally absorbed in the document she held in her hands. When the study became dark, she switched on a lamp and continued to read. The horror piled on horror. Not even dry, terse tone of the report could conceal the drama in it. One thing was clear. Someone was methodically attempting to damage or destroy Roth and Sons. Someone in the highest echelon of the company. On the last page was a marginal note in her father's neat, precise handwriting. Additional pressure on me to let the company go public? Trap the bastard. She remembered now how worried Sam had been, and his sudden secrecy. He had not known who to trust. Elizabeth looked at the front page of the report again. No copies. Elizabeth was sure the report had been by an outside investigative agency. So in all probability no one had been aware of this report but Sam, and now herself. The guilty person had no idea he was under suspicion. Had Sam known who he was? Had Sam confronted him before his accident? Elizabeth had no way of knowing. All she knew was that there was a traitor, someone in the highest echelon of the company. No one else would have the opportunity or the ability to carry out so much destruction on so many different levels. Was that why Sam had refused to let the company go public? Was he trying to find the guilty person first? Once the company was sold, it would be impossible to conduct a secret investigation, with every move being reported to a group of strangers. Elizabeth thought about the board meeting and how they had urged her to sell. All of them. Elizabeth suddenly felt very alone in the house. The loud ringing of the telephone made her jump. She walked over to it and picked it up. Hello? Liz, it's Reese. I just received your message. She was glad to hear his voice, but she suddenly remembered why she had called him. To tell him that she was going to sign the papers, let the company be sold. In a few short hours everything had completely changed. Elizabeth glanced out into the hallway, at the portrait of old Samuel. He had founded this company and had fought for it, dedicated himself to it. Reese, Elizabeth said, I'd like to have a board meeting Tuesday, 2 o'clock. Would you please arrange for everyone to be there? Tuesday at 2 o'clock, Reese said. Anything else? She hesitated. No, that's all, thank you. Elizabeth slowly replaced the receiver. She was going to fight them. She was high on a mountain with her father, climbing at his side. Don't look down, Sam kept saying, and Elizabeth disobeyed, and there was nothing below but thousands of feet of empty space. There was a loud rumble of thunder, and a bolt of lightning came hurtling toward them. It hit Sam's rope and set it on fire, and Sam started falling through space. Elizabeth watched her father's body tumble end over end, and she began to scream. But her screams were drowned out by the roar of thunder. Elizabeth awakened suddenly, her nightgown drenched with perspiration, her heart pounding wildly. There was a loud clap of thunder, and she looked toward the window and saw that it was pouring outside. The wind was driving the rain into the bedroom through the open French doors. Quickly Elizabeth got out of bed, crossed over to the doors, and pushed them tightly shut. She looked out at the storm clouds that filled the sky, and at the lightning flashes across the horizon, but she was not seeing them. She was thinking about her dream. In the morning the storm had passed over the island, leaving only a light drizzle. Elizabeth hoped that the weather would not delay Alex's arrival. After reading the report, she desperately needed someone to talk to. In the meantime, she decided it would be a good idea to put it away in a secure place. There was a safe up in the tower room. She would keep it there. Elizabeth bathed, put on a pair of old slacks and a sweater, and went down into the library to get the report. It was gone.